What makes William Shakespeare a great writer? Is it just that he lived a long time ago, and your English teacher loves to give you writers who lived a long time ago? Well, no, of course not. There are many writers who lived a long time ago, and most of them have been forgotten. Well, sometimes it's difficult to read Shakespeare's works. Maybe it's because his works are difficult to read. That's not the case either, as it turns out. Much of Shakespeare's writing is in fact surprisingly easy to read, as we're going to see in today's lecture. So what is it that keeps people coming back to Shakespeare century after century and saying, I see something really amazing in this writer, something that makes me want to read his works and go on reading his works? In today's lecture, we're going to discuss two of the things that make Shakespeare a great writer. And they're important qualities to recognize in literature because we can also find them in other great writers. And those qualities are, first, his ability to depict human nature. In particular, his ability to make characters consistently express an emotion, and a believable emotion at that. Also, his use of irony. Characters misunderstand the significance of their own words. Today we're going to be talking about Julius Caesar. And in order to understand the first passage that we're going to be analyzing, we need to touch briefly on Caesar's accomplishments just before his assassination. Now, just before his assassination, Caesar was in the process of consolidating power over Rome. He was able to do this because he had gained a lot of power himself and a lot of popularity too. So he had a string of military victories all over the known world over the past 20 years of his life or so. He had written an account of his campaign in Gaul that is still regarded as a model of Latin prose, and he had pushed through many political reforms that improved Roman government. Any one of these accomplishments would make the guy worthy of note, but to have all three of them is something really extraordinary and explains why he had achieved so much prominence in Roman politics and society at this point. But along with his power, Caesar had also made some enemies. And some of them were concerned about what he would do to the Republic, which they valued. They didn't want him to set himself up as king because that would be the end of the Republic. And others of them, however, were simply jealous of the power that Caesar had because they wanted some of that power themselves. And one of those people was a man named Cassius, and he plays an important role in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. Throughout this first part of the play, Shakespeare does an excellent job of giving Cassius a consistent and believable emotion. He simply shows how envious Cassius is of Caesar's achievements. Cassius is trying at this point in the play to make an argument to Brutus that it's time to do something about Caesar because Caesar has grown too powerful. But in trying to make his argument, rather than talking about the threat that Caesar poses to the Republic, he instead talks about the injustice of a man like Caesar having power, while a man like Cassius does not. Let's take a look at the introduction to his argument. Cassius says, I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life, but for my single self, I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as I myself. Now this is the only line that we're going to need to paraphrase. He says, I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life, but as for me, I'd rather be dead than live to be of awe of someone no better than I am. So this is Cassius's argument, that Caesar is someone no better than I am. It sounds like the remark of an envious man, and Shakespeare goes on to prove that. Here's the beginning of Cassius's evidence. I was born free as Caesar, so were you. Well, let's consider this as evidence. Think of the great people that you know, people that you admire, athletes or musicians or political leaders. They obviously were born with other people in their peer groups, but these are the people but the athletes, the musicians, the political leaders that you admire, they rose up above the members of those peer groups. So being born into a certain condition is no reason why someone should end up in the same condition, 50 years down the line. What matters in how we judge people is by their achievements, not by their birth. Cassius goes on to say, we both have fed as well, and we can both endure the winter's cold as well as he. Now, when he says we and you, remember, he's talking to Brutus here, right? So he's saying, basically, we've eaten food that's just as good, and we're just as good at surviving cold weather. Well, if you consider this, of course, it seems like a ridiculous argument. Just because you eat the same food as a famous golfer Why should you be as good a golfer as he is? Just because you're good at shivering in the cold, why should you be as good a musician as someone who plays the bassoon really well? So Cassius here shows his envious nature. Shakespeare shows Cassius's envious nature by making Cassius avoid talking about the areas where Caesar has genuine accomplishments, and instead having Cassius focus on the areas where he and Caesar just happen to be the same. Well, Cassius goes on with his argument by talking about a swimming race that he and Caesar once had, supposedly. Caesar said to me, "Darest thou, Cassius, now leap in with me into this angry flood, and swim to yonder point." Upon the word, accoutred as I was, I plunged in and bade him follow. So indeed he did. Now at this point, Cassius is taking a break from trying to tear Caesar down by trying to build himself up. So you see that he says, upon the word, I plunged in, to show that he's a really decisive man. And he also says, I bade him follow, as if he's a commanding figure. And so indeed he did, shows that Caesar supposedly obeys Cassius. But of course, Caesar is the one who's decisive in more important matters, like military affairs, where he uses his ability to make quick decisions and his ability to give commands to great effect in securing military victories. So again, Cassius is trying to show that he's as good as Caesar, but if you know what Caesar's accomplished, you know that Cassius is not even in the same league. Well, in going on to talk about the race, Cassius uses a metaphor that attempts to puff up his own abilities and qualities, but instead just shows that he is really, again, not in the same league as Caesar. But ere we could arrive the point proposed, this would be the finish line of the swim race, Caesar cried, "Help me, Cassius, or I sink. I, as Aeneas, our great ancestor, did from the flames of Troy upon his shoulder the old Anchises bear, so from the waves did I the tired Caesar." So Aeneas is a legendary Trojan hero, the founder of Rome. Anchises is his father, and you should know that Troy is the city the Greeks defeated in the legendary Trojan War. So Cassius has this fancy metaphor in which he tries to compare himself to a great man. But there's a lot of problems with this metaphor. So first of all, the action of Cassius is not really comparable to the action of Aeneas. Cassius is pulling a friend out of a river. Aeneas is fleeing a city that's been attacked and destroyed and is in the process of burning down. That's far more dangerous than what Cassius is doing. Also, Cassius is saying that I have the old Anchises on my shoulder, right? And the old Anchises is a person that's Aeneas' father. It's a person that Aeneas loved and respected, but Caesar, as we know, is not someone that Cassius loves and respects. In fact, Cassius is planning to kill the man. And finally, Cassius compares himself to Aeneas, our great ancestor. But really, who's more like Aeneas, Cassius or Julius Caesar? Caesar is the one, actually, who's trying to raise Rome to new levels of prominence after a period of political confusion. So, and he's also the one who has, great charisma and leadership abilities, like Aeneas, our great ancestor. So, Cassius goes way wrong in trying to compare himself to Aeneas. And ironically, the guy that he doesn't compare to Aeneas is the one that deserves to be compared to him. That's, again, Julius Caesar. Well, Cassius continues with his argument. He had a fever when he was in Spain, and when the fit was on him, I did mark how he did shake. 'Tis true, this god did shake. His coward lips did from their colour fly. I did hear him groan. Well, Cassius's argument here seems to be that Caesar got sick one day, and therefore he doesn't deserve the acclaim that he's received. Of course, this argument is ridiculous. It simply shows Cassius's pettiness and his envy. The fact that Caesar was sick when he was campaigning in Spain and winning many military victories, if anything, shows how much determination and willpower Caesar had, that he was able to campaign through sickness and ignore the difficulties that his physical body was giving him. All right. So, this brings us to the ironic elements of some of the famous quotes in Julius Caesar. We've seen how Cassius is merely an envious man who can't recognize the great accomplishments that Caesar has. And throughout the play, we're going to see some other difficulties that he has as a leader. He's not a great leader. For one thing, he keeps deferring to Brutus, and once Brutus joins the conspiracy, and following Brutus's ideas instead of sticking with his own. But this is a problem because Brutus has very bad ideas for how to handle the conspiracy, and Cassius, for all of his faults, actually has pretty good ones for how to handle it. Well, given that fact, it's ironic that Cassius says at this point to Brutus, "Men at some times are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings." This is a very famous quote from Julius Caesar, and it's always used as an example of carpe diem, seize the day, sound your barbaric yawp over the world. But this line is highly ironic. We've already seen that the conspiracy fails in part because Cassius decides he's going to be an underling with respect to Brutus. He doesn't take charge. Moreover, by the end of the play, even though at this point Cassius is talking about being master of his fate, by the end of the play, it's Cassius who's starting to believe in fate. He thinks he's seen some omens that say that he's fated to die, right? So he can say in this quote, "seize the day," but he really lacks the will to do it. So ironically, maybe he is fated to be an underling, and maybe the fault is in his stars. Well, there's another quote that's also highly ironic. This is a quote from the end of the play where Brutus is trying to make a decision. And he's arguing that the conspirators need to take the fight to their enemies on the plains of Philippi. As it turns out, as Cassius points out, this is a bad decision. But Brutus insists that it is a good one. And to justify his argument, he simply says, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries." So he's making an analogy with sailing a ship. And you have to sail when the tide is favorable in order to avoid being pushed back into shore. So he's arguing that now is that time. This is the one time in their lives that they'll be able to attack their enemies and possibly win. Well, it's another seize the day quote. Act now before you lose your chance. But as he has done before in the play, Brutus is here making a bad decision. It's a mistake to think that he must go to Philippi because he has only this one chance to defeat the enemy. As it turns out, the people that he's fighting don't think this way at all. None of them issue statements that are like this one that Brutus makes here. So this quote is highly ironic. It's given to us usually as a seize the day quote, and yet it's used in the play as by a person who's making a very bad decision. Perhaps people who think along the lines of, "I have only this one chance," people who over-dramatize the importance of the choice before them, are prone to making bad decisions and are bad leaders themselves. Well, that's food for thought. Shakespeare's greatness, that he can consistently display a quality of human nature in a particular character, and also that he's capable of using irony, of having characters make these statements whose true significance the characters are really unaware of. Thank you.